nice old Elizabethan establishment, ideal for these sort of events. Nice ambience, very difficult to manage and look after, but a beautiful place. And we've got a full moon tonight, which is rather nice. I didn't specifically plan it, but you know, the moon decided to sort of get in on the act and lend us some of its power and vibration and quality, because the subject matter is quite serious. The new resistance. I've been in Poland on and off. Jadwiga and I, Jadwiga's in the audience here, we work as the International Coalition to Protect the Polish Countryside. I spend a lot of time in Poland, actually more than I do in England at the moment. And almost everything we do is sort of related to this issue of a resistance. Now the resistance is quite a well-known phrase in Poland, because in the Second World War, the Poles fought the most extraordinary rearguard battle against the Nazis in the sewers of Warsaw, surrounding streets. And it inspired me when I read about it, probably when I was about 16 years old. And it struck me as one of the most important things I read about the Second World War. People coming out of the sewers with old rifles and shotguns and anything they could find, knowing that they were outnumbered, totally of course, hugely outnumbered, and with the opposition with weapons that were the weapons that the resistance people had were absolutely no match for in any respect. But they nevertheless fought to the death and fended off the Nazis for about 6 months to a year this way, and produced a lot of damage in the process. So the word resistance conjures up in my mind fighting for something one believes in, quite simple. And as you would have seen from the poster, the question is, do we have this ability today to fight for what we believe in? Because the subject of the lecture really is about the fact that we're up against a situation which is a sort of war. It's a sort of war of attrition on our freedoms, on our civil liberties, even on our spiritual aspirations, on our interests in fairness and cooperation. All these things we're at war with. So, in essence, the issue of resistance is very broad. And what we're going to be discussing and talking about tonight, I deal with the subject in a very broad way. I've used quite a lot of written notes to make sure I cover the issues I really want to talk about, and then I'll also be using the flip chart a little bit. And at the end of it all, I hope we have a chance to have a discussion about this. And after that, you will have some resistance soup. And if you can get your teeth into it. Okay, well, to my mind, from quite a lot of it from Poland, it's been a long summer of obeisance, and a very good year for the sale of little plastic Union Jack flags in England. But, sadly, it seems unlikely that the sale of little plastic Union Jack flags is actually going to turn around the stricken economy. I observe that the national emblem still excites a fair amount of patriotic fervour in this country. Most of it manifests itself as a largely subconscious desire to uphold traditional values, as they're called. The renewal of a sense of identity with long-standing traditions, and well-absorbed secondary school history lessons. Lessons I recall as dutifully maintaining the sanctity of the British Empire and other similarly robust colonial adventures. But none of us were taught, or even informed about the hard reality of death, destruction, and denial, without which such a legacy could never have succeeded. Forgive me if I'm wrong, maybe some of you went to more enlightened establishments than I did, but by and large, the standard history book, the 1960s, was still putting the empire in a very rosy light. In fact, Western colonialism is reported to have killed 50 million people, while Hitler's wars killed 20 million people. In many ways, the adoration of the Olympic spectacle carried on the national fervour fostered by the Jubilee bonanza. Any criticism of either was increasingly expunged by the mainstream British media as proceedings reached their crescendo. The glitzy Olympic spectacle was symbolised by the strange architectural contributions and massive military, police and private security operation. What was it? 40,000 troops, private security firms and police, missiles on the roofs of surrounding buildings, aircraft carrier moored in the Thames estuary, other aircraft carriers and destroyers all around the area where the yachting was taking place, and a bill of £9 billion, which I guess we paid most of, but not all. But this was given an added twist by sponsors representing the worst elements of the junk food market and chemical industry. McDonald's, Pepsi-Cola, and Dow Chemical, which has still failed to compensate hundreds of victims of its factory disaster of the 1980s. But we are so good at ignoring such deeds, because doing otherwise might impinge upon our preference to enjoy the games. We prefer not to allow any interference of our preferred understandings and perceptions by taking a closer and perhaps more critical look at the often contradictory circumstances surrounding such events. The same goes for our daily confrontation with slogans, symbols, propaganda hype, the general rhetoric of self-interest of our modern world. Indeed, we're deeply reticent to examine the deeper motives of such symbols and their meanings, and to analyse the effect they have on our psyches. Yet, most of the symbols on display, such as the logos of multinational giants, and even those on display within the architecture of the Olympic site, and during the opening and closing ceremonies, have esoteric meanings that can be directly linked to Masonic interests and the worship of the occult. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the great Olympic Games. But how many of you have looked into it? Judging by your faces, very few. Well, the fact that the forces that maintain the powers of the elite cabals that operate behind government and behind mainstream banking, pharmaceuticals, agribusiness, oil, and weapons are of occult origin, powers which ultimately lead those who wield them to establish themselves as architects of control. Now, it's the architects of control that we're going to have to be fighting with the new resistance. But we have to first of all understand that they are the architects of control, and we have to face it. It requires courage, as a matter of fact, especially if one's coming from the sort of background which some of us are in this room, where we're in amongst this game, even trying to play it. Such control is epitomized, of course, by the CCTV camera explosion and the spying on emails and internet communications which is taking place today. Well, I don't want to go into it in any detail here. This desire to control fellow men and women and just about all aspects of nature can turn a profit has already led to transgenic companies owning key parts of the germplasm of grain, grass, and vegetable crops through patenting, licensing, and technology transfer agreements, as well as advancing laboratory-designed DNA now capable of usurping and overriding the human genome sequence, which is our common inheritance. This, in my view, is leading to the vandalization of the genetic code of our planet. Now, that is something to resist. The issue of the seeds is worth considering in a bit more detail. 75% of the world's commercial seeds are owned by just 10 corporations. 75% of the world's commercial seeds are owned by just 10 corporations. And you know, last year, when we gave a talk at Vigo and I, we said 65%, and now someone told us, no, it's gone up, it's 75%. Next year it'll be 85%, next year it'll be 90%. And very, very soon, we will have no seeds left in the commercial world I'm talking about, which we, independent farmers, can say are our seeds. They all belong to the Monsantos of this world. And we will have lost control of a vital factor in our ability to be independent. However, the most ubiquitous weapons of this control imperative are TV and advertising, which combine to print a subliminal message upon our unconscious, and most noticeably, relentlessly promote the doctrine of consumerism. Consumerism is a totem of modern society, to which we are all expected to show our obeisance. I'm right in this. So, for example, the golden arches of McDonald's, and the fatherly face of Colonel Sanders, and the italicized letters that make up the word Coca-Cola become so familiar as to appear almost like friends. They exert a type of subconscious comfort zone on huge segments of the population. Never mind the fact that between them they continue to destroy the health of millions of these very same people across the planet, and use animals and people as dispensable commodities. Can you see that? What does it say? Coca cancer. It's the real thing, is what it says. It's a sort of ad-buster way of trying to make people understand that if they're drinking this sort of stuff, they're basically killing themselves, you know. And it's a very effective way of doing it. Every time I've given this card to people, they've stopped drinking Coca-Cola. They've said they have, I suppose it's probably true. And once I gave it to a lady in the House of Lords who demanded that I send her 200 more, and she was going to distribute them around the house. So this is a good resistance tool, ad-busting. Now, you know, this was put out about 10 years ago, actually, by a poet who lives in Oxford called Heathcote Williams. He designed it. On the back of it is a telephone number for Ring for More Information. And it's the telephone number of Monsanto headquarters. That's another clever trick. And they got rung so many times that they left the country. So it's a very effective trick. It's Coca-Cola, or at least Pepsi-Cola, uses aspartame, which is a sweetener, and it's genetically modified. But you don't see this unless you read the bottle extremely carefully, and it's not even printed on most of them. So, quite literally, aspartame has been shown many years ago to be carcinogenic. So people that want a Coke, must have a Coke and all the rest of it, are quite literally killing themselves. Confucius has said, signs and symbols rule the world. This is really in relation to what I was talking about, the power of corporations, the power of this sort of wording, Coca-Cola, you know, imprints itself so strongly. Even Confucius, what was that, 3,000, 5,000 years ago, was saying signs and symbols rule the world. Well, it must have been going on for a very long time, all this that I'm talking about. A Swiss research project run over 5 years revealed that today just 147 corporations own 80% of the world's total wealth. Just 147 corporations own 80% of the world's total wealth. This was a huge project, incidentally. They were working, universities in Switzerland, working over 5 years, and they kept on finding that all these corporations were connected up with each other. And they nailed it down and down and down and down to this number. 80% of the world's total wealth owned by just 147 corporations. The Queen owns 1/6 of the land surface of the world. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah. Well, you know, you have to start thinking of it. She owns Canada, she owns Australia, she owns New Zealand, just for a start, and then there's plenty more. And you might think the word own is wrong, but it's not if you look it up and really study it. She quite literally does own them. I don't know whether she'd be able to put them on the market just like that, if she wanted to. Probably be quite difficult. And anyway, who would raise enough money to ever buy them? You know, our Queen is the richest woman on the planet by such a long margin that any of these Arab sheikhs come absolutely nowhere near her. Okay, so the signs and symbols rule the world, yet the great majority of us don't think we're even affected. And that's a very important thing. We don't think we're affected. Edward Bernays, the founder of modern advertising in the 1920s and close friend of 3 US presidents, said back in the 1920s, not that, I'll tell you what he said, well, maybe it is. People will yield themselves with perfect docility to our moulding hands. Before we get to that, but that is coming up, before I get to that, there's a few more statistics which are interesting here. In the USA, 1% own 47% of the total wealth of the country. 30% are on food stamps. You know, that tells you. And yet, sadly, many countries in the world are still looking to America as some symbol of hope and freedom and democracy. It's not the case, not by a very long way. And yet, at the other end of the spectrum, 800 million live below the official poverty line, which is the United Nations figures, on less than $1 a day. Look, contrast these two. You know, 75% of the world's wealth owned by 10 corporations. At the other end of the spectrum, 800 million living below the official poverty line on less than $1 a day. 800 million. 2.5 billion living on the poverty line, $2 a day. The $2 a day is what's giving us cheap Honda cars, and cheap Mazda cars, and cheap Ford cars, and cheap everything we buy in Britain is based on that. So we shouldn't be proud of that. It's a disgrace. And of course, we've outsourced all our most valuable companies and corporations that we would have been proud of as being British. And we turned them over to sweatshop production lines in order to keep the capitalistic growth scenario that we're all dependent upon going. And it's going to jump back on us. There will be karmic revenge involved. It's impossible that it wouldn't be. Yes, Edward Bernays, the founder of modern advertising, close friend of 3 US presidents, said, people will yield themselves with perfect docility to our moulding hands. Now, Bernays was an extraordinary character. He was very charismatic, apparently. And when he was asked to put up some sort of propaganda message so that various presidents could win elections, etc., he came up with these extraordinary slogans. And he discovered that they had a most dramatic effect on people. And actually one of the really rather humorous things he did was, women in America in the 1930s, 40s, 50s were not getting a fair deal, so he was employed to say, how can you raise the status of women and the women's liberation movement even? He said, oh, by having them smoke cigarettes. So they arranged a special parade to New York, where all the women at the front were, and he said, immediately everyone thought, wow, they're tough. They're like men, you know, they can be executives too. They're smoking cigarettes. Women smoking cigarettes. What? You see how easy it is? If we're living subliminally with all the propaganda and all the ballyhoo that's being shoved into our heads, we actually do believe that's quite clever. Edward Bernays again. We will regiment the masses according to our will without them ever knowing it. You see? Without them ever knowing it. In Britain today, the average time spent in front of the TV is 4 hours a day. Now, I read the statistic out of a newspaper recently. I'm afraid I don't remember which one. It might have been the Independent. And then it says 6 hours when adding further electronic media. And one of them, for statistics, was then 8 hours when you put the whole lot together, including your iPod and, you know. 8 hours a day, just absorbing electromagnetic waves and information, most of it virtual reality. And there's a man in the front playing his mobile phone now.
I'm taking notes.
He's taking notes. We'll edit that. I know the man. If any mobile phone goes off during this, you'll be told to leave. But please turn them off. I forgot to say that at the beginning. You're very good. I don't think it's ever happened actually during these lectures. It usually does, so it's kind of quite irritating. But, right, yes. Also, and so they have, yes, in Britain today, the average time spent, well, that's 6 hours a day spent looking at television screens, etc., 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 does explain quite a lot of the reasons why we're not able to carry out the new resistance. I think everyone would admit that. You know, we're so busy absorbing stuff and trying to deal with it, and you know, it's mostly bits and pieces, and information in its own right, you know, the absorbing of huge amounts of information in its own right is a very, very energetic process. It takes a lot of energy out of us. Actually, computers do take a lot of energy out of us. We have this experience constantly. So, by partaking in this 21st century diet, the idea that we might be participants in a grand conspiracy has not even occurred to most of us. And if it should, many will simply tell themselves that it's all rather unfortunate. And let's have another cup of tea. Well, yet even that tea is probably coming courtesy of a vast monocultural plantation employing slave labour and thousands of gallons of pesticides. Yeah. So, even the full-back cup of tea no longer really stands the test. We even manage not to feel complicit in fostering this brave new world which now encircles us. After absorbing the daily dose of 4 hours of TV, many even comment that most of it was basically rubbish, but nevertheless appear incapable of turning off the set. Similarly, there is an alarming tendency to take mainstream TV news as a verbatim fact and make no further investigation as to whether this is or is not the case. A current example can be seen in the way the mainstream Western media describe anti-government militia groups in Syria as freedom fighters, whereas the non-partisan inquiries describe the same militia as paid-up mercenaries. You see? Which do you believe? As Aldous Huxley writes in Brave New World, sentence on the next page. Democracy and freedom will be the theme of every broadcast and editorial. Meanwhile, the ruling oligarch and its highly trained elite soldiers, policemen, thought manufacturers, and mind manipulators will quietly run the show as they see fit. And Ian William Goddard, who I believe is a philosopher, said a society whose citizens refuse to see and investigate the facts, who refuse to believe that their government and their media will routinely lie to them and fabricate a reality contrary to verifiable facts, is a society that chooses and deserves the police state dictatorship it is going to get. Henri de Journal, however, said it in a slightly more humorous vein, if you're feeling depressed. A society of sheep must in time beget a government of wolves. Yes. Someone said, and I'm not sure who it was, but I like it very much, you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Well, wolves are often depicted as cunning creatures, knowing how to pose as caring, thoughtful creatures, while disguising their howling as eloquence. But we, the sheep, appear to need our political wolves as a protectorate to do our thinking for us, as we hand them more and more powers to manage us as they see fit. Just only a very few examples, because it's a big subject in its own right, really. Data gathering, monitoring us, mobile phone masts, Wi-Fi, illegal demonstrations outside the Houses of Parliament, not allowed to criticise the government if you're within a quarter of a mile of it. It's a very long list, and most people aren't even aware it's happening. But since the wolves actually fear that we might, one day, become sufficiently disenchanted with our lies and embezzlements, they steadily erode our civil liberties and independence while setting in motion the conditions that ultimately lead to the imposition of a police state. Actually, the police force is being privatised, isn't it? One police force, I think in Staffordshire, already is. So what you're going to see is a gradual, like everything's been privatised, and the water was privatised years ago. This water, Thames water here, was first of all owned by the French, and then the Germans, and now it's owned by the Australians. That's incredible. The water, yeah, owned by a German, French, Australian corporation. You know, so if we fall out with the Aussies, they turn the tap off. And then we'll have to go back to our wells. Hardwick used to have a complete system of private water, but my father couldn't cope with it really because the pipes were rusting. They probably put in about 1900. And he said the cost of getting them repaired, you're digging, you know, all the men who were supposed to be working in the woods spending more time digging up old pipes and trying to repair them. And he's turned it back over to the water board in 1954. But there is still the well head. It's 300 feet, so a hugely deep one. All the way down to sort of River Thames level. It's still there. I guess we could resuscitate it if we really needed to. And we do need to, probably. Aside from the fact that the condition of water that we're drinking today is not good, and therefore one is advised to test it. If you take it out of a plastic bottle, though, it's even worse. So don't do that. You know, then it's full of petroleum, essentially, and other impurities as well. So the police state, which were much closer to that state in 2012 than most dare to believe. And, for instance, while we here at Hardwick are bothered by a neighbouring estate's tourist helicopter flights, we soon will all be bothered by unmanned police-controlled drones snooping on every detail of our daily lives. And they've already been allowed in America. America sets the trend and England copies it, essentially. I'm sure you've seen that many times, I hardly need to tell you. But these drones, which are used in Pakistan and all over the place, which are a sort of easy form of murder, isn't it? Where the people operating them sit back in leather chairs and Houston with a cup of coffee. They bring up a picture of some unfortunate Pakistani people running around outside some school, and they blast them to hell. And then they go home and have their, boiled eggs and whatever else they need. And they say, we had a good day, darling. We had a great day, darling. We smashed, That is warfare today, and that's going to be the way warfare is conducted in the future, exclusively. It's really frightening. It's really frightening. And we're going to introduce these drones into England. They were already practicing over the Olympic Stadium. How to deal with them when they come flying over? I've still got a gun, but I know that if I shot at it, they would be on me straight away. They have cameras underneath them and they focus very, very tightly on people. And that's it, I would be out and I'd be in jail for the rest of my life, I expect, if I tried to shoot a drone now. But the fact that they might have a shot at me, that's perfectly allowed. That's the way we conduct ourselves today. So, we are being readied, I believe, for such an imposition as this that I'm describing, which will make CCTV cameras look like child's play. Why are we allowing this to happen? Answer. We have been conditioned to believe that we are being protected. Yes, there could well be terrorists lurking in our towns and villages, ladies and gentlemen. Al-Qaeda even, behind every hedge in the countryside. You need the drones. You need the massive police presence. You need the missiles. You need all the mass and research weapons establishment. You need it because we're protecting you, aren't we? Well, anyone who believes that has got a serious problem. We are even made to doubt whether our own motives are not under scrutiny. I and my partner Jadwiga have been included amongst those who governments like to table as eco-terrorists. Have you heard that, Michael? What an apt label for those working to prevent the rapid advance of ecocide via mass consumerism and the free market, and now the defunct growth economy. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've progressed from the brown rice and sandals organic hippie to an eco-terrorist. Now that is progress. So, there you have it. And yet, we Homo sapiens still call ourselves human beings and generally consider ourselves an intelligent species. The empirical evidence for this is increasingly hard to find. It is my assertion that if one deliberately lowers the blinds over truth so as to try and preserve a hiding place away from reality and refuses to engage in any form of meaningful resistance, which is the only tool we have to combat the lies and perfidy of the modern state, then I don't believe we can consider ourselves to be truly human. After all, what is more empowering than getting involved to prevent our own enslavement? And what is more disempowering than not doing so? You can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. Now we've got through the hard part, everybody. Relax. Now's the easy bit, the solutions. So these are the key elements we need to put in place in order to establish a proper resistance, a new resistance movement, and to thereby become empowered. We have to re-empower ourselves. There's no other choice left for us to do that. So the first thing is an awareness that one is not free. You know, one thinks one's free, one has to go and examine that, scrutinize that point, and discover that it simply isn't the case. We are conditioned and we have been moulded by propaganda and by our education to the degree to which we're virtually blind. Then, a dropping off of all old habits that block the process of becoming aware. Now, you know, those are the things like the Coca-Cola, I don't know what it is, all turning on the television without really thinking about what you want to watch, and just all the 101 baggage that we carry, which is actually, in a certain sense, creating a veil around our ability to become aware and see reality for what it is. So that's a precondition also of moving to the next level. The courage to turn awareness into action. You see, that's important. Some people say, "Oh, I'm conscious, I'm aware," but when you ask, "What are you doing about it?" Well, you know, so there shouldn't be any gap. If you become aware, you should immediately lead to action. Why sit around and think about it for a year? The fourth point: a ready willingness to challenge the dominant system. That's what we're talking about. That's the subject of this lecture tonight. A ready willingness to challenge the dominant system. And then the fifth point, to work in a spirit of cooperation with others of a similar persuasion and aspiration, because it only is going to be in cooperation that we can make the change, obviously. You know, we can't all do it as individuals working separately from each other. We have to pool our resources and go forward that way. So that, I think, is very clear. The sixth point, to keep the physical, mental and spiritual bodies well tuned and alert. You see, you can't be conscious or aware unless you do that. Because if our bodies are in a state of sort of low energy, entropy, and our minds are in a state of virtual reality, or we're trying to support the system which is destroying us, we are not, in any respect, attending to our physical, mental and spiritual bodies. In order to do so, we have to change our lifestyles. We have to start working with nature, with universal forces. And we are spiritual beings, but we've covered ourselves up to such a degree that we don't even recognize our own spirituality. So I don't say everybody, of course, I'm talking generally speaking. Then, number 7, to be ready to practice civil disobedience and non-cooperation in defense of all threats to greater justice. Now that's tough. Believe me, it's tough. I can't even say that I've sat in the middle of a road yet and made an absolute point of refusing to be moved, but many courageous people do. I suggest more that this is an issue now of working from where we live, and when you get faced by something which seems completely ludicrous, instead of thinking, how can I compromise, or how can I get round it, or how can I go to sleep about it, or how can I, in any way, is to say, no, I'm going to stand my ground. I'm going to stand my ground about things that are really important in life, and I'm going to draw a line in the sand. And I'm not going to allow myself to be pushed back beyond that line. Because somewhere you've got to draw the line. We've got to draw the line. Otherwise we go on and on and on retreating, still smiling at each other and drinking our cups of tea and pretending that life's fine. And that's no good. For all our sakes, we have to move beyond that point. So the new resistance will be expressed in our attitude and actions in regard to, now I just put the most basic and obvious issues here, of course there'll be other items, but food, farming, environmental care and health. This is so fundamental that unless we start there, we're not going to make very much progress. Unless we can start with the things that nourish us on this earth and get that sorted out and get that right, we can't really progress on to the next stage. Economics, social concerns in general, cultural quality and spiritual practice. Now, what I'm going to do is give you a brief outline of how I see each of those falling into place. So in food, farming, environmental care and health, it means growing or purchasing fresh, local and seasonal food produced in environmentally friendly ways, and it means avoiding supermarkets and all junk food. Those are the conditions. And if you compromise on those, or any one of them, it won't be the real thing. I'm well known for my haranguing about supermarkets. When I was on the Sol Association Council, I used to amuse people at great length by telling them why organic food should never be sold in supermarkets. And they even gave me a round of applause on one occasion. But of course it made no difference. They were still utterly determined that this was the only way to grow the movement, as the expression was. But what is a supermarket when you explore it, you know? It's one of the biggest rip-off corporations in the world. And if you sell your stuff through the biggest rip-off corporation in the world, you eventually degrade the thing you're selling to being exactly the same. And it's time we learned the lesson. So, in economics, means putting your money where your heart is. Removing deposits from highly culpable mainstream banks and putting them in ethical banking institutions that will not take deposits from main offending players. I think it's crucial we do this because, you see, otherwise we live schizophrenic lives. We say one thing when we do another. And that's not going to get us very far. I don't say this is the only thing we should do with our money. I mean, ideally, we would invest in local schemes which are good, positive, humanistic type approaches to life, improvement, you know, in all these different spheres, be they cultural, be they ecological, be they spiritual, whatever. You know, ideally we sort of put it into our community life and we'd see the results growing in front of our very eyes. And if we can do that, that would be the best method of all. But in the meantime, we must get it out of these hideous banks. I mean, for God's sake, what we've seen in the last 2 years, the main banking stream, is criminal. But none of these people have been arrested. And it's still going on. And government's completely culpable. It's in there with them. It's ridiculous. So we have to take over. We have to take over. It's the only logical conclusion you come to. Life's far more exciting once we do, believe me. It's incredibly boring if you don't. And it's going to be very exciting, I'm quite sure of that. So the other thing is, purchasing needful items from people and places that are examples of quality and caring. Local wherever possible. Local wherever possible. Local wherever possible. Never forget that. Being open to bartering and other forms of non-monetary exchange. Now this is growing. Look, I mean, as we arrived back from Poland, in the place where we were staying, I opened it up. There's a sort of, what's it called? The London Standard. It used to be, had to pay for it, now it's free. A brilliant article about Bristol. In Bristol, the mayor even got up and said, look, we're fed up with all these multinational corporations stealing the business from independent people. What's happened to small independent businesses? We've lost them all. So we're going to invent the Bristol pound. And the Bristol pound will be shared by small independent enterprises who want to attract people to support them in a cooperative spirit and in the spirit of re-energizing the local economy. The mayor himself even did. Bristol's a big town, and this isn't Totnes, this isn't Lewis, they've both done it. And as one of the suburbs of, one of the London suburbs has done it, Hackney I think it is. Bristol's doing it. Now this is very encouraging. This is very encouraging. So that is the Totnes, the Bristol pound. You know, where you go there, Bristol, and you go to a place and you exchange your pounds for Bristol pounds. At the moment, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. You give them a £5 and you get 5 Bristol pounds. And then once you've got that, you know, you'll find a whole list of people, and it's gradually, and it's fairly fast, I think, it's actually increasing this list from plumbers to bakers to farmers to electricians. You know, all these professionals are getting involved. This is actually the beginning of the resistance in a big way, because once you get out of that mainstream banking scenario and a sort of government-run one, and you get into this bartering of exchanging pounds, you can even invent a new tax system. You know, you sort of when you're bartering, you bypass taxes. This is a big threat to the status quo. Big threat. And good luck to it. So, social concerns is the next one. Well, it involves recognizing our connections with others and supporting that which encourages positive growth, higher awareness, and opportunities for the socially deprived, because, you know, obviously we should be helping people less well off than ourselves. We're trying to do it here at Hardwick by offering the Pathfield Outdoors enterprises the chance for these socially deprived kids to run around in the woods and to build teepees and to make fire by rubbing sticks together, and they've got some very excellent leaders who devote huge amount of time and energy and patience to these children. And these children are sent in increasing numbers now from schools where they simply don't fit. And they are gaining a whole other experience of life. So obviously we have a role, all of us as individuals, because we're compassionate beings underneath, to try and support those who are less well off than ourselves in whatever way we can. So under that issue of social, I put that, but many, many other elements, of course, could be described. Culture, well, in my view, it involves the immersion in and promotion of the best of the arts. Participating in activities that bring people together for the purpose of raising consciousness. And the arts should be a consciousness-raising tool. The fact that they aren't anymore is just another example, sadly, of where everything's gone offline. I mean, there are some arts that still are, let me not degrade all of them, but there's too many that are a sort of mirror of the existing problems of society and are not really raising the human spirit up to appreciate the higher purpose of our being on this planet. The best of the arts can do that, and they should be used to do that much more at the moment than they are currently. Of course, practicing and enhancing one's own creative skills. Very important for us all. We must do it in order to give ourselves the vitality and the imagination we need to create a new society and a better one. Spiritual practice. People get a bit queasy when you talk about spiritual, I noticed in England. Well, I don't know. I was brought up in the Church of England, and actually it was rather interesting, really, because I remember as a 7-year-old boy, my mother took me down to Whitchurch quite regularly, every Sunday, I think. And the Anglican Church has an extraordinary phrase which you're supposed to say, which is, it's about the original sin, and it's actually that I am a poor and miserable sinner. And I remember from the age of 7, I refused to say it. And later on in my life, I thought, God, well done. You know, what a nonsense. What is this crap? You know, I'm a poor, miserable sinner. I'm a child and totally innocent. I know nothing about this. Am I going to live my life with this imposition on me, always feeling guilty before I've even started? You know, poor, miserable sinner, forget it. And it's a nightmare that the church has imposed this sort of thing on people. It's an absolute nightmare. No wonder what a mess we are when the church does it to you. So, you know, I get very excited about that. It's sad, because the church ought to be promoting the best of Christianity, the best of the work of Jesus and all the other brilliant people that once helped to form this spiritual network, which saw us through the Dark Ages, as a matter of fact. And here we go into another one. I don't think it's got the guts or the imagination to get us through this one. So forget the church, we have to take over, and we have to enlighten ourselves. Yes. So it involves making space for nurturing the higher being in all of us. That is what it's about. Getting onto a one-to-one relationship with the supreme consciousness. That's what it's about. God. Getting onto a one-to-one relationship with God. You don't need the priesthood. We can do it. Listening out for the inner intuitive voice, which is the true guiding light of all meaningful actions. It's in us, you see. We just have to hear it. We just have to hear it. That is the truth. If we can follow that, all the other stuff will fall away. And we'll suddenly see just how controlled we are. But we have to find a way of tuning into it, and regularly, not just occasionally. 2012 is a particularly propitious year for deepening one's spirituality. We are passing through the vortex which connects the end of one 26,000-year cycle to the beginning of the next. 26,000-year cycle. It can be a rough ride if one's not dropped off much of the baggage which acts to hold back the free flight of the soul and which veils our true selves. It will be a very rough ride because, as Terence McKenna said, Terence McKenna was a very remarkable and a highly imaginative sort of botanist and psilocybin taker, and he had great visions, and he was a very humble man. But he saw very clearly what was happening, and he said at this particular time, 2012 and beyond, the spiral is tightening and getting faster. Everything is becoming the present. Time and events go non-linear. That is happening. That is happening. We have to be quite light and flexible to allow ourselves to follow that. This is what's happening. If we resist it, we're in a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. It's not easy. We're all struggling with it. Once a critical mass of individuals have awoken and started to practice these advances, we will have the foundation of the new resistance and the tools to change the power base, which otherwise will remain largely unchallenged and unaffected by the now familiar staged protests and reactionary outbursts that express the rumbling frustration of our present society. That government has no problem dealing with this sort of stuff. It's been going on for years. I know exactly how to contain and kettle, as the expression goes, such gatherings now. We need to get on with it. Time is not on our side. But getting on with it is essentially a joyous task, providing our heads are in tune with our hearts, and our hands are remembered to be important tools of creativity, and not just mechanisms for typing messages on computer and cell phone keyboards, or putting the quick chill dinner in the microwave. They are more than that. We have so much still to discover about our potentiality as human beings, but we will never do so if we insist on only using 1/10 of the capacity of our neocortex and a similar percentage of the creative intelligence encoded in our genetic makeup. Every one of our 13 billion cells is an intelligent being. This is a man called Bruce Lipton, who's a very advanced cutting-edge biologist and has written a number of books. You can look them up on the internet. It's an extraordinary and wonderful thing that he's writing about in his bio. He's not the only one. He's very close to quantum physicists and their work, and even to a degree even Einstein, who was back earlier, which was the discovery that our cells, our very cells, the 13 billion cells that make up our body, are individually created beings in their own right, intelligent ones. And they're having this intelligent dialogue with the environment around us all the time. It's not just our neocortex. So we have to find a way of communicating through our cells. I don't mean our cells, I mean our cells. Interesting. Well, and our cells, okay. So that's a most fabulous discovery, I think. As the visionary botanist anthropologist Terence McKenna once said, our world is endangered by the absence of consciousness. I think this is a very true point. Our world is endangered by the absence of consciousness, and I would add, and the absence of action. Now, if you found this a little bit heavy, I mean, it's no big deal, is it really, to get all this sort of thing sorted out in the next couple of weeks? Try this if you're thinking. Now, this is a very remarkable spiritual teacher in India, whose spiritual name is Sri Sri Anandamurti, and whose non-spiritual name is P.R. Sarkar. He had a huge following, and he still has quite a large following today. And he was one of the wisest and most searing sort of prophets that India produced over the last 100 years. And he said this: people will need to understand that human beings, as the most thoughtful and intelligent beings in this created universe, will have to accept the great responsibility for taking care of this entire universe. Will have to accept that the responsibility for the entire universe rests on them. Thank you very much. Trying to do is share my own thoughts and feelings and work. I'm a writer as well as being a farmer and an activist and all the other things I do. And of course I have written this book, which was published 3 years ago, which you can purchase here. And most of the talks I'm giving are based on various chapters in this book, in one way or another. And you will find certainly plenty of fragments of this talk in this book. And I am working on some other writings, which is more like putting together all essays I've written over the last 20 or 30 years and publishing them under another title. And I do find talking to people this way and writing at this point in my life a very creative process and a very enjoyable process. And I don't want you to take anything I said tonight personally, in the sense that I'm trying to force anyone to do anything. I'm actually sharing what I perceive as being the most crucial issues of our time. So that is an opportunity for us to have a short conversation now, maybe for a quarter of an hour or so. If anybody wants to raise any thoughts or ask any questions or come up with any ideas, this is a good moment to share it, and after that you will have earned your resistance soup.
I did it to 2012. Yeah. My personal take on it is that we are going to reach a certain tipping point in consciousness.
Yes.
Never mind the apocalyptic type events that are going to occur in the movies and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think it's going to reach a certain level where people are going to start having these conversations.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, how do you have any advice or tactics for trying to speak to people who are so indoctrinated within the system that they have no capacity to even acknowledge what you're saying, let alone consider it? That is our particular form of action, is to try and spread awareness.
Well,
some people are involved, some people are just shut off. How do you get through to them?
Exactly, a very good question. Very difficult to answer, because actually there is no one way. There's only lots of ways, and I think the truth of it is that the more I draw on trying to find a way of helping people to see this bigger picture, really, and to be more flexible, the more I find the stuff in myself which I'm discovering. I'm learning all the time, and it's welling up in me like this. It's like some angelic force is saying, "Come on, you didn't know this one, use that." And when I'm writing, particularly now, it's all pouring out. And I wouldn't have predicted this 20 years ago, that I would be doing this sort of thing. I was trying to enlighten people about food and farming and eating, but I've always been very passionate, and I think part of the issue is that we're rather frightened of passion. You see, the English are very frightened of passion. We're frightened of sex and all this sort of thing. It's just stupid. Again, it's like the church and all those sort of people taught us to be scared of all these things. And I'm not suggesting we should all have an orgy, no, not at all. But I'm suggesting that this sort of innate fear of sexuality and sensuality is a very beautiful word, maybe a better word. We're not taught any of this stuff at school. I mean, I, of course, went to the private prep school and public school where they teach the opposite. They teach you to be totally regimented and to suppress your emotions, Suppress them, my boy. They didn't think about it. I mean, this is killing people, of course. And we Brits have a big problem with this. We don't have this sort of problem.
Well, would it benefit from a name or when you see a symbol, the Bristol pound is and I've heard of the Liberty dollar as well, and I think in Germany they've got several independent
Yes, I heard about that
as well. But the chap that created the Liberty dollar is doing 20 years in jail, unfortunately. And it didn't go down too well over there. But those are symbols, and you kind of, just like you've said with the capitalists, the big corporations, a symbol is extremely powerful. Like the women smoking cigarettes at the start of the march. So You kind of need something like that to. You know, I mean,
Yes, I agree with that.
There could be thousands of people around the country in
sure.
gatherings like this.
Yeah.
How do they get
No, that's
united?
well said. That's very well said. Well, I was right then. Come up with something, and let's share this one. This is exciting. This is really exciting. I mean, these meetings have meaning. This house is full of extraordinary vibrations and things, and it likes this sort of stuff. So let's do it. But I think the term, the new resistance, is a good term, don't you? Yeah. This is a sort of David and Goliath issue. And David, it's a good story, that one in the Old Testament, isn't it? David got his sling out, wham, and the old giant went, and it's fantastic stuff. Is this what we can do?
Julian?
Yes.
There's a lot of bit about new resistance. Why don't we call it the last resistance?